بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Once again, Jazakallah khair for Darul Huda, Sheikh Khalid, for allowing me to come and speak with you for a little bit, inshallah, and kind of tell you my story of how I ended up sitting in front of you right now. How I went from the background that I grew up in to, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, over 20 years ago, guiding me to Islam. So we'll start at the beginning. We'll make this relatively chronological, like in a sequence of how actually time went. So I grew up in a place called Fort Lauderdale. Anybody know where Fort Lauderdale is? Fort Lauderdale? Florida. Yeah, where in Florida? I ask this question because I talk to people sometimes, and I tell them I'm from Fort Lauderdale, and they have no idea where it is. I tell them it's in Florida, and they're like, is it in Jacksonville? Which I don't understand, because Fort Lauderdale is a relatively, especially when I grew up, was a pretty well-known city. Apparently it's not anymore. So anybody know generally where it is? It's near Miami. It's South Florida. So it's much like Dallas is when I grew up. It was a very diverse place. People from cultures all around the world. So you interacted with people from everywhere, from South America, from all over the Caribbean, from all over America. You had people who had moved, their families had moved from New York. We had a lot of New Yorkers, a lot of kids who were from New York families. People from all over the place. Africa, Middle East, I mean, it was a very diverse place. So you grew up around a lot of different cultures. So I grew up in Fort Lauderdale. I grew up in a family that was, this is going to be strange, was partially very religious and partially not. So there was a part of my family, particularly my grandmother, who was very religious. My grandfather, not so much. My grandfather, he was the classic once a year Christian. He would go maybe Easter, maybe he would go to Christmas service, but he wouldn't, he wasn't really, that wasn't his thing. But my grandmother was very religious. She was the complete opposite. She was the typical 3 to 4 days a week in church, in the choir, active in her church. And it was predominantly Southern Baptist church, but she was also into the Assemblies of God and so forth. And these are all kind of different denominations within Christianity. So I kind of grew up in this. My mother, my parents were divorced when I was relatively young. I grew up mainly with my mother. My mother was not very religious either. So that's the kind of the environment I grew up in. And I grew up in a time when, I used to ride my bike to and from school, and my grandfather owned a business, so in the same general neighborhood where my school was. So I'd ride my bike from the house to school, and then I'd ride the bike from the school to my grandfather's work, and I would spend most of my afternoons around my grandfather, who was the single most important male figure in my life growing up. And he had a huge influence on me when I was young, as far as how I perceived the world, and again, how I perceived what was important. Again, he wasn't very religious. He was more focused on his business, on things in this life, traveling and these types of things. Those were the big things to him. And so that's where I grew up. And around the age of 10, not around the age of 10, I was 10, my grandfather passed away. And it had a profound effect on me, because at that point, I lost the single most important male figure in my life. And I started to think, even at that age, like, what's this all about? Well, I mean, this central figure in my life is gone. I was directionless for a while, because, he was the guiding force for me as far as what I should be focused on. He was very, very adamant about academics. He pushed me hard in school to excel and to be the best student I could be. And because of that, I was a relatively good student. I'm not going to say I was an excellent student, but I was a relatively good student through those years. But when he passed away, school didn't matter anymore to me, because the motivation for it was external, right? The motivation for it was external. So at that age, And we moved from the neighborhood that we lived in right after my grandfather passed away. We moved from that neighborhood to a different neighborhood. So I had a whole new set of kids around me. I was trying to find, it was transitioning from elementary school to middle school. So all this was happening at the same time. And it really started making me question a lot of things, even at a young age. And I started really thinking about kind of what is it that matters in life? And what is it that actually affects people? Like, what is it actually that affects people's lives day in and day out? And I started thinking about all of these things, and I had a close friend when I moved to this new neighborhood. I became quick friends with somebody who lived very close to me. I could basically see his front door from my door. And he was he was a couple of years older than I was. So he was heavily into politics and economics and all these kind of things. So that was my first kind of entry into what is it that affects people's lives. And so at that point I started thinking, well, if you look, it's these political systems, it's all these things. This is what affects people's lives because they enact laws and they enact policies economically that affect people. And because of being around this friend of mine, I started reading a lot of